Okay, how many are students? Okay, I see a light. That's all I see. Okay. Students again? 3? That's it? 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay. How many are teachers? How many are professors? Okay, I'm not going to talk to them. How many are disabled? I counted 26 when you walked in. Nope, 27. We're rather 28 if I count myself. Can't see without your glasses, you are disabled. For people who don't have a disability, the technology just makes things easier. If you've got a disability, you need that technology. Glasses are technology. So it makes things possible. This leads to the question of, is ESL a disability? Do you feel disabled because of the way I'm talking now? I can talk faster. I can talk louder. But most of my experience with ESL has been dealing with my students who have come from other countries to live in an English environment. Not as much here where you're learning to go to a different environment. Those students often do feel disabled. That's me. That's me. When I was very young, I moved to Italy before I started school. So I've known what it's like to change languages a few times. And even though I was born on an English-speaking country, I moved to an Italian-speaking country, lived there for years, and moved back to an American country, and did not understand what the people were saying. So I do feel it's a disability. So for my students, I had to make accommodations, adjustments so that they could learn and understand even though English wasn't their primary language. And so I would have to change what I was doing. Now, many people look and see, and not to say that there are not wonderful programs, we don't necessarily have to use other programs and things that we've already got. Like, I'd like to start with Word and how I can use Word to make things easier. Okay, I can tell you right now, bigger is easier. So, if this is the font size I'm using, and I want my students to read it, even if nothing else has changed, I just made this easier for them to read. We interpret larger print as being easier to read. Like the program you've got is, for a lot of people, would be very difficult to read. It's smaller print, very dense. Just doing that. Also notice the font that I'm using here makes it easier to read. This is the font that is currently used in your program book, Times New Roman. Does anybody know why it's called that? Anyone? No. Okay. Well, it was designed for a newspaper called The Times, and it's designed so that if your fingers rub the ink off the paper, you can still read the words. To do that, they added all of these little marks on the letters called serifs. And the serifs allow you to get that information. The problem is the serifs are extra information versus this. This is an E, that is an E. Well, let's not look at that E. Here we got an S, there we got an S. This S is easier to read than that S. So when you're starting with students to learn to read and write in English, it's much easier to start with what's called a sans serif font, like Arial, which is the bottom part, versus Times New Roman, because there's extra information, and that extra information can create cognitive overload as they're trying to figure out what the letters are. So you want to simplify the letters. Bigger and easier for them to read. You also have to be very careful. Many people say, we'll make it even easier. We'll just write in all capital letters. You learn the one alphabet, it makes it easier. But once you've learned the alphabet and you start working, it actually causes you to slow down because people often will read words by their shape. So we know that once somebody can read, when you read this versus this you will read 20% slower than the other one. So you'll actually be hurting them by writing in all capital letters. So for my students, when I had, well, we have LEP, which is Limited English Proficient. We have ESOL, which is English as a Second Language, and we have ESL. For my students, which were mostly the first two groups, I would do these things to anything they had to read because, for instance, their textbooks would have problems. I can also add my dictionaries to help them. One of the problems many of my students had was they used to get very frustrated because they would type in their name and it would tell them it was misspelled until I showed them how to add their name to the dictionary, and then they would stop worrying about it. But initially they kept thinking they were misspelling their name. Skip the thesaurus. When I have new words, I would highlight them that I wanted them to learn. So I want to differentiate those words. And I could do that, but of course I had to have a color printer. But when the word was in the book and I wanted them to do it, I would highlight all the times that the word would occur. Now, if I did this by hand, that would have to be double click and change, double click and change, double. Instead, if you are familiar with search and replace, you can tell it to search for a word, replace it with the same word, and then tell it you want it to highlight the word. And it will go through the entire document highlighting the word that you wanted them to see. So if you're looking for that as, oh, I wanted to show them this verb, I wanted to show them this noun, here it is, and it's already all marked through the entire document. Have any of you seen this before? I see no marks, I hear no words. All right. Whoever computer this is, I'm going to change it for a minute. And no, no. No. Here we go. No. Yes. See this one right here? What does that say? Proofing? Something like that. And right down here, the last one, the box that isn't checked, that says readability statistics. So now, when I run a spell check, it will tell me that this document was written at the 12th grade level. So if you ever want to check your work for what grade level the students are writing at, in Word, all you've got to do is click that box, and from that point on, every time you run a spell check, it will come back with, in English, this is written at the 12th grade, 5th grade, 4th grade level. And for the reading ease, the higher the number, the easier it is to read. So if you've got your computer, you can turn that on now. And then it will do the spell check the next time you want to run something in English. It does not do it for Korean. The other thing is, you know your computer will talk, right? Okay, this one's going to be a little harder. Go back, go to this one, change to show all, and find something that says speak. Had this set up on the other machine. Missed it. Okay, there it is. I'll add it to the Rapid. There it is. Highlight. It's reading. Oh, she has that set to speakers. Well, it's reading aloud right now, actually. I'll have to tell it to stop. Oh, it's up all the way. So whatever you write in English, you can turn on the speak button, and now all of a sudden it'll read it in English. So we know, for instance, my students were usually much more able to understand spoken words than written words initially. So I could have them read their textbook by listening to it instead of just trying to figure out the sounding out of all the words. Then two, we have a problem with spacing. If we look at this, depending upon the experience of students, that's not enough space to differentiate between one word and the next word. And we have a very simple solution for that, which will make things much easier to read even if you're just using it on a screen someplace. Oh, no, wrong one. Oop. We're going to search for one space. I hit the space bar once, and we'll replace it with two spaces. And does this say replace all? This is next. Which one says replace all? This one? There. And now from a distance, this is much easier to see as we've separated out the two words. This became a major problem because now with word processing, the spacing between a space has become one of the smallest of all the letters. So for many people who are just starting to read this as a language, that makes it that much harder to see the difference when one word ends and the next word begins. So by increasing that spacing, we can decrease the cognitive load and increase their ability to read. If you've got an old machine, you can also ask it to summarize documents for you. Basically, when I have my students read the textbook, a textbook contains somewhere between 25 and 33% important information. Then the next 33% is supporting information for the important information. And the last 33% is interesting fluff material for the first thing. If you use a summary tool, and there are a bunch of them, you can ask it to take a document and summarize it down to the 33%, which will be just the facts. So when I'm working with my students and they're having to read, like in my science class, and they're trying to read that, they're having a hard time differentiating between the important information, the supporting information, and the fluff. So by doing this, I can cut it down to just the important information so that they can learn that while they're also learning the language. Are you familiar with the strategy of reading while listening? She is, but I'm not surprised for a literacy person. Okay, so when you read a book, especially in another language, I had even a harder time. When I started coming back to the United States and reading, I kept reading words in Italian even though they were written in English. It's because we use the same letter structure. So if you want to understand how words actually sound, it's good to have somebody else read them to you. And we do that through a strategy called reading while listening. So while you're reading the book, you play the book as an audio book and listen to it at the same time. So you try to read with the person. I also used leveled books and leveled articles. This is a free service called Newslia. And so it's ELA, not LEA. Newslia, and what it happens to have is I can pick the Lexile reading level that I want you to read it at. So it's already gone through and made a short version of just the facts plus supporting material, using larger words. You can work your way up, and as teachers, there are quizzes and other things that go with it, so you can have them practice in understanding. You can use a scanning translator to get through. I use picture enhancement for a lot of things. For instance, there's the Noun Project, which is, I believe, 30,000 plus pictures of actions, nouns. I also have a program called Writing with Symbols. So I can type something out in English, and it will take every word and convert it into a picture with it. This has recently been changed to widget, and so as you highlight over the word, it shows you the picture of the action. So this is a good way for starting learners to get something without having it written in another language. They still have to figure it out. It's written in English, and it will then provide them with that information. Spelling is difficult, I can tell you that. I had a vision problem which actually caused me to not be able to learn to spell very well. And so sometimes I will use a word prediction or voice input because English spelling is just so strange. And so if you've got Google, in Google there's a section called Tools. Under Tools there's voice input, and you can actually just go ahead and talk to it and it will type for you. So if you'd like to practice speaking and seeing how it comes out, you could use that. There are some other ones that will do the same thing. I also used text-based games. This is Zork, if you heard the speech yesterday. Zork, though, is a text-based game. There are no other kind of pictures. You have to read the text, understand the text, and then give a 2 or 3 word response to play the game. So my students only had to type 3 words. They didn't have to do a whole bunch of things or learn a whole bunch of new player movements. Oh, that's my Newsly again. Okay, I also use a thing called Simplified English. There's a few of them. You input the text, it will rewrite the text for you using other words. Because in English, just about every word has multiple meanings. So sometimes if you can't understand it and you can have it put into a different word structure or a simpler word instead of a more complicated word, it will do that for you. So a paraphrase tool, Simplish, Rewordify, and Explain It to Me all do that, although Explain It to Me is good for professional articles. And then for my presenter, she asked about parsing the other day. Here are parsing tools. I'll be glad to send this to you. And parsing tools will allow you to input a sentence and either have it, depending upon which one you're using, like parts of speech, color codes every word, or this is a different one. It will take the word and break it down into the stem and leaf structure. Now, I had planned to go online to show you these and show you how they work, but since the internet is down for some of these machines, I can't do that. So can I answer any questions? I think that was last. That was last, yes. Questions? Be glad to email you the copy of the PowerPoint or wherever they want me to put it so that everybody can have it. I'm looking for hands, but it's dark. This has got a variety of levels depending upon what you have. From my experience, I worked in the Virgin Islands, for instance. We'd have a lot of Down Islanders coming from a bunch of different languages. And our biggest problem was we would get Haitians because Haiti has no written language. So for them, it was a whole new thing. They could understand pretty well, but to build that construct of, oh yes, the sound has letters, letters have sounds, and going back and forth, some of the things like audio support became very important for them. For others, I've done this all the way, I still do this in college for helping students in terms of, here, try listening to it instead of just reading it. Read and listen at the same time. I have Saudis now, some Chinese, and some South Americans. Yes, sir.
Accessibility. Oh. Right. Could you comment on adapting text for accessibility versus using authentic materials? And do you see there to be a tension there? Is it just a matter of beginner learners versus advanced, or if you could just speak to that?
For primary source material?
Authentic materials of any kind are not made accessible in the ways that you mentioned today, in that they're often written with serifs, they're often written in 12 or 10-point font if we're looking at blog posts, if we're looking, well, those can be adapted, but newspaper articles,
yeah,
things like that.
Like I say, I'm going under the disability concept. So if I'm disabled for whatever, I need help, I need my glasses for whatever. I'm old now. I tried to read a print book this couple months ago, and it was like, okay, now I have to put on my reading glasses just to read a print book because it was so difficult because the print was so small. I've been very used to digital print where I can increase the font size. So that's an accommodation, but I haven't even changed the content. So if all I'm doing is going online to get the content, let's say it's a newspaper article from, I know the Times here is written in English. There's an English version. So if I'm trying to read that and it's just the print is too small, going to an enlargement system is just an accommodation. I haven't changed the source, even if I've gone digital just to make it larger. By adding audio, when you first started to read, somebody read to you all the time. So it's just an accommodation. If I can understand the words, if I've never seen some of these words that they're using, and I'm not sure how to pronounce them, especially in English, because in English we've got German pronunciation, French pronunciation, English pronunciations, and then sometimes other pronunciations that somebody has made up. So, and if it can interpret that correctly and say that out loud, then at least I'll know what it is. Yes?
All right. Thank you for your presentation. In your presentation, you focus on the text media. So what about the image and audio and video?
Audio and video?
Yeah, yes. So there are several, the media types.
Right,
So in your
for
presentation-
audio and video, I would often still use text. Like a great thing, okay, it's off. I'm doing it right now because I have 3 deaf students in an online class. So I've got a bunch of videos they're supposed to watch. So what I did is I connected a cross cable through my computer to play the video so that it went into my word processor, which was doing speech recognition, and it typed up the whole transcript for me. So then I was able to send that to them and put it up with the video, so as they're watching the video, they can read the transcript. If I want, I could do the next step, which would be to subtitle the whole video, but that takes a lot more time than just writing the transcript. For audio, I can do the same thing. I put in my cross cable, and then I just turn it into text, and I let them have it that way, so that they've at least got text support. Because text you can work through much slower if you need to, okay, I don't know what this word means, and go on, versus if it's just straight audio, they'll need something else.
Thank you.
Somebody else? And I did this for my students the other day. They were blown away just by the fact that the machine will type for them. Oh, I'm blind on that side, I'm sorry.
Related to his question earlier, I think while you're trying to simplify the text, like control for the difficulty of vocabulary, you may end up sacrificing the authenticity of the text.
No, because it gives you both. So remember it had 2 columns right there? One was the original text, and the next is the simplified text. And it's marking which words it's changed. So I can look at that and see that, oh, faculty means teachers in a school. And then see, okay, I see what the original word was, and now I see what that means. So I can interpret the lesser, which would be no different than a student coming up to you going, what does this word mean? And you go, oh, that's teachers in a university. So I don't have to lose the initial language. It's still there, but it's being supported by something else adding to it. Come on, your students, ask a question. Nothing? Who's their teacher? They won't ask a question. Oh, you have a question. I'm sorry, I thought you were their teacher.
I'm a teacher. When I apply those explanations to my classroom, they want to make a composition. They want to make a lot of sentences. In the case, they can make grammar mistakes. So in case of simplification or in kind of through those skills, the misprinting or make mistakes is corrected automatically?
No, they would have to correct it first.
First, the student must correct their grammar mistakes. After that,
They could do that.
So they don't correct automatically?
No.
No.
There are ones, no, even the ones that I'm doing and I'm having it use the text-to-speech to change it for me for my deaf students, I still have to go through and eliminate words because it tried to understand or something else that I put in there. And I don't want them to read that, so I delete that. Or it thinks I said one word when I said it, like the difference between spit and speak. It might get confused. And in which case I will have to still correct that before I send it to them. There's always a risk of plagiarism. Anything digital has the risk of plagiarism. That's why I was even surprised at the session that I was at yesterday that was talking about one of the tools to correct English, and part of it was plagiarism. And that's the main use of that application at my university, is to do plagiarism checks. Because, well, I had another article which was all about the legal aspects of internet and what it's doing now, because there is a woman in Tennessee who is suing a school in Georgia because somebody copied her dissertation and submitted it as his dissertation in Georgia, and they accepted it. So she's suing the school, asking for his doctorate degree to be removed, that the school will be liable, that the dissertation committee is liable, and then he had it published as a book, and they are being sued too. And that's all one plagiarism, and it's like, and when I went to my doctoral dissertation groups, because I'm a committee member, not the lead, and I said, do any of you check for plagiarism? And they were going, no. It's just something that now we have to check all the time for student work. Yes, ma'am.
So my question is, like, I allow my students to use Google Translator in class so that they could, access more text or they could start composing, But then sometimes, like, I wonder if allowing them to use all these like assistive technology actually helps them learn their language, because like I found out that from one moment my students start making this really fancy compositions, and I ask them like, oh, how do you do this? Like, did your English improve? And like, Google Translator, So then I start wondering if this is like really educative for my students.
Yeah, and I have the same problem in terms of when I'm asking you to do something. So yeah, there are times when you don't want something like that. You want to turn it off. The same thing for, like I deal with a lot of elementary teachers, and they get very upset that Word underlines the word in red to let you know it's misspelled. And for that though, we have found that actually identifying the misspelled word and then picking the right word does actually help them learn to spell. But I don't think it applies as much to a second language, because they get very dependent upon the translator for a word, and they're not putting together a sentence necessarily for what that. So I would say, yeah, it would be reasonable to say start it, but after a while you'll have to move away from it. Anybody else?
Well, time is almost up, so I think we would have to end. Thank you very much for an eye-opening presentation, Dr. Cavanaugh. We could learn that the notion of assistive technology can be expanded to the field of English language teaching.
It can be expensive, but it can also be free.
That's great.
All those
it'll
things
be
I
good.
showed you were free.
It'll be great if you could share the materials so that we can check out the features on the internet, right? It would have been better if we could check out the features on the internet today, but it didn't work, right? So if you don't mind, I would greatly appreciate it if you could share the materials with us. And it made me think that we can use assistive technology to better facilitate the learning processes of our students. And I think the presentation is quite timely and also highly relevant to the field of language teaching, as it is more important than ever to accommodate the diversified needs of our learners. Okay, so once again, thanks very much for your very informative presentation. So let's give him a big round of applause.